Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this latest online session of the All-Party Group on the environment. My name's Chris Skidmore. I have the pleasure of chairing this cross-party group, the largest group to cover issues around environment and sustainability in both the Houses of Commons and the House of Lords. Today, we have an opportunity to discuss a piece of legislation that is currently in the House of Lords. We're coming back to the House of Commons, no doubt, in due course. And that is obviously the Energy Security Bill, hotly anticipated in terms of how the government may respond not only to the modernisation of our energy system, but also the international scenario where we have the United States having taken forward an Inflation Reduction Act, the EU about to respond. What will the UK's response be, and can some of that response be seen in the ambition of the Energy Security Bill? We have a fantastic panel today. I'd like to thank all panelists that include Baroness Worthington, Sam Hall, the Director of the Conservative Environment Network, Matt Copeland from National Energy Action, Gillian Cooper from Citizens Advice, and I'll give a bit more detail about speaker biographies as I introduce them in turn. Just by way of housekeeping, I wanted to make sure that everyone's microphone is switched off. It looks like that is the case, just to make sure there's no nasty feedback. And if people want to ask any questions, please do type your question into the chat box or else raise your hand. The common protocol for all party groups is we take questions from parliamentarians first before turning to those from our associate members. But I'm really hoping we can get a good discussion going about the context of the bill and the opportunities it might provide when it comes back to the House of Commons. I'm keen to hear from the speakers myself about what I should be doing when it comes to looking at the bill. So our first speaker today is Baroness Bryony Worthington. Baroness Worthington is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and is co-chair of Peers for the Planet. Of course, you may remember Bryony for being part of that 2008 team that worked on the Climate Change Act, and she's very much seen as being an author of that landmark legislation. So we're delighted to have you with us, Bryony. And if we can get maybe an update from yourselves for about 5 minutes on the bill stages in the Lords, what's been sort of happening, where are the areas of key concern and focus, and where you feel the bill could potentially be improved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Green Alliance and the APPG for organising this this session. The energy bill is inching its way towards the Commons and to completion. It's been a rather slow process, as people will know. It started off and then it was paused and then it restarted, and we're now in something of another pause, waiting for report stage. But we've completed committee. And we've gone through it as the Lords does, line by line, clause by clause, and had a number of very interesting debates at committee stage. The bill, as you know, it's positioned as a bill for the long term. It was not the bill that was used to respond to the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. It was written pre that, really, and it was looking forwards towards infrastructure questions, market regulation, and technology support. It's a lengthy bill, but a large portion of the bill concerns itself with capture and storage, carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen. There are other really important measures within there about some of the market reforms, including bringing in a systems operator, an independent systems operator, and opening up grid for competition. So there's some structural things in here that are very important. And then there's a range of additional measures that look at fuel security and security of supply. There's quite a few areas that I'm sure we'll touch on as we get into the questions, but the things that I've been focusing my attention on are the relationship between the focus on carbon capture and storage in the bill and then the conversation that leads to in relation to hydrogen, compared to other aspects of the transition which relate to electrification. And one thing that we've been pushing the government on, and will likely do so again at report, is to have a top line strategy that really looks in detail about the benefits of electrification of your energy system at a systems wide level. And it's not well understood that when you electrify and you replace fossil fuels in transport and heat, you make a fundamental efficiency saving. So your primary energy needed, the system as a whole gets more efficient. And we've been trying to press this from day one, really, that if you take a siloed approach to energy, you may come up with some very odd outcomes, very suboptimal outcomes. But if you take a whole system approach and you consider what we've got, the benefits the UK already has in terms of a largely decarbonised electricity system, the next logical step is to electrify as much of the economy as you possibly can, both because you get an energy efficiency saving, but also because it's one of the proven ways of getting quickly to emissions reductions. So the bill doesn't contain a strategy for electrification. I dearly wish it would. That's one of my top requests, is that we think about the system as a whole and we work on the strengths that the UK has, which is a large amount of clean electricity and a very good success story in helping to decarbonise the power system through policy. So I'm sure we'll come to this. When we get into some of the details, it is really important that the heat system is decarbonised effectively. It's sort of next in line, if you like, in both industrial heat and domestic and buildings requirements for heat. And there are some measures in here which have been seen as somewhat controversial. We've had long discussions about the hydrogen approach to putting hydrogen costs, hydrogen levy onto the electricity bill payers' bills. And I think the government's listened, I hope it has, and is proposing to amend the bill before it comes to report to take the payment of those hydrogen payments off the electricity consumers' bills, which seems completely correct. The hydrogen pathway is really an enabler for industrial heat decarbonisation and not necessarily the right thing to do for domestic consumers. So the idea that electricity consumers will be paying for this seems highly wrong, especially when you look at record profits being accrued in the upstream oil and gas sector. There's obviously capacity to pay there that doesn't need the support from consumer bills. We can talk a little bit about the hydrogen trials, village trials, that attracted an awful lot of attention. I imagine when it comes to the Commons, that will get quite political. The 2 villages that were selected have been very effective in raising flags of concern that they haven't been dealt with well by the gas distribution network providers, and that their concerns have not been answered and they've not been sufficiently consulted. And there are some quite worrying powers being taken in this bill that would allow the gas operators to forcibly enter a property and disconnect from the gas using these powers that they're proposed to be taken in this bill. And there's a big question about whether that's appropriate and indeed whether it is an infringement on human rights to have this power applied in this way, given that it isn't absolutely clear at all that there's an environmental benefit to hydrogen being used, 100% hydrogen being used in the home. So that's been quite a source of controversy. I think the last thing to touch on is that towards the end, we got into a conversation about supply side of the energy transition. We were dealing with this bill at the same time as a new coal mine was being approved in Cumbria, and there's obviously oil and gas licenses being granted and an onshore oil extraction project in the south of England. And the concern amongst the peers who were represented in that debate was that there is no government policy on supply side of the transition. It's being left to planning inspectors and the planning system to decide on whether or not it's appropriate for the UK to continue to invest in extraction of fossil fuels, even as we profess to be leaders and tell other countries that it's time for they gave up fossil fuels. There does seem to be a bit of doublethink going on with relation to our own licensing regime. And there's nothing in the bill really that addresses this, although amendments have been tabled and a debate has been had. But the yawning gap in government policy at the moment, I think, is on supply side, where there is no policy at all to guide decision making beyond the power of the inspectors and the planning system. So that's a quick canter through some of the issues. There's a lot more to say, including amendments have gone in on Ofgem's duties, community energy schemes. There's a whole host of things. It's a fairly broad ranging long title. So as a result, quite a lot of new aspects have been promoted by people. So you can expect a good and I'm sure comprehensive debate when it arrives into the Commons. But I've just run through some of the issues that I've been engaging with from my side. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Bryony, for a masterful expose of being able to cram into 5 minutes everything that this bill encompasses and some of those priorities that you've been focusing on in the other place. Really appreciated. I'm sure there'll be some questions on the back of your contribution. I'm now going to turn to Sam Hall. Sam has been in government as advisor, policy advisor at DEFRA, but he's probably more well known to everyone on this call as being director of the Conservative Environment since 2019. And you work closely with Sam as a Conservative MP, 120 Conservative MPs who belong to the caucus in Parliament of the Environment Network. Sam, thank you very much for your time today. And I think you were going to sort of focus on SEN's priorities for the energy bill, I think including levies, energy efficiency and Ofgem. It'd be good to hear from you where you feel some of the focal points for the debate may come in the Commons when the bill returns.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation to join this panel today. So yeah, I want to start by saying that it's, I think, really welcome that this bill has restarted its progress through Parliament. There was a brief pause last year when it looked like some of these measures might not get taken forward, and I think it's very welcome that the government has found the time in a busy legislative schedule to get this bill back on track and actually start implementing some of the proposals and measures that were in the net zero strategy, the energy security strategy, the energy white paper a couple of years ago. So I think it's very welcome before we start diving in to talk about particular areas for amendments. And I think generally there's a lot of support for lots of parts of this bill. The way I sort of thought I'd look at it is to look at the bill's two big broad aims. So firstly, making our energy supply cheaper and more secure. This is by accelerating our transition away from expensive fossil fuels, which we're very dependent on in the power sector for about 40% of electricity and for the vast majority of our home heating. There's a suite of really positive measures, I think, in the bill that will look to reduce our reliance on expensive fossil fuels and help drive this transition from creating a new future system operator, putting obligations on heating engineers and boiler manufacturers to sell a rising proportion of heat pumps going forwards, changes to regulatory codes on things like energy storage, reforms to the energy performance certificate system, which will hopefully drive more accurate and faster energy efficiency improvements to people's homes, and changes as well to speed up the deployment of offshore wind by looking at things like permitting and also the offshore transmission network. So a whole host, I think, of really positive changes, quite technical in nature, that will hopefully accelerate that transition away from fossil fuels. For us, though, I think there are kind of a couple of areas where we've been speaking to MPs and we think that there are things where the government could look further to push things further. So firstly is on this issue of network reinforcements and grid infrastructure. The overwhelming complaint you hear from renewable energy companies at the moment is the length of time it takes to get a grid connection so you can hook up a new solar farm or wind farm to start adding clean sheet power into the grid, or indeed to add heat pumps or electric vehicle charge points on the to enable the electrification that Bryony was highlighting. And one of the challenges, there's many different reasons why grid connections take so long to get, but one of the challenges is Ofgem, which is the regulator that authorises investment in network upgrades. And their sole duty, as they were constituted and set up in legislation, is to look after current consumers. And that means, as a result, they scrutinise and bear down on any proposal to levy charges on consumers by energy network companies. And so they generally take a view where they're not enabling this anticipatory investment in the grid infrastructure that we might need in 10 or 20 years' time. And so this is why one of the asks that renewables companies and other campaigners have been highlighting is to add a net zero duty to Ofgem's remit, so that they can and have the legal backing to start planning out the needs of our grids in 10-20 years time, and unlock that anticipatory investment that will hopefully mean that we can plug in those new renewables faster and also enable the wider electrification of the energy system that we need. So I think that's probably one of the top challenges that it would be good for this bill to look at, and it's something that lots of MPs have been highlighting with renewables projects in their constituencies, and keen to see those projects start generating sooner. The second area is on energy efficiency, and whilst I think a lot of this is not something you could necessarily create in legislation, but I think it would be good to sit alongside this bill for there to be some comprehensive strategy to improve the energy efficiency of our building stock. Countless experts from the Committee on Climate Change to the Environmental Audit Committee have highlighted the policy gaps in this space, particularly for people who own their own homes, where there just isn't the incentives and financing capacity to get people to make those upgrades. Whilst I think, there's going to be a range of different approaches for different building types and housing tenures, the government does need to come up with a comprehensive plan, and suggest it might include things like an energy saving stamp duty, so people would get a discount if they, or a rebate rather, if they retrofitted their properties a couple of years after sale, or new financing mechanisms to attach loans to properties rather than to individuals. But I think, this is a long-running gap, and I think it will make so much else that the bill wants to do cheaper and easier if the amount of energy that we consume and we waste is low as a result of energy efficiency improvements. And finally, the kind of second aim of the bill is around giving the UK a head start and a competitive advantage in some of these new green industries. And of course, it's a big theme of Chris's net zero review as well. With the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU response, in the competition for these new industries is intensifying. And I think the bill tries to set up a business model for two key clean technologies that the UK could be a leader in and that could generate growth and regeneration in our industrial heartlands. So carbon capture storage, which we've talked about a little bit already, being one of them. The other big one is hydrogen. And I think the government is right to emphasise these business models and to put these business models into the bill, but I think they've not yet fully worked out the best way to fund some of these measures. And I think there are concerns from quite a broad coalition, particularly on the hydrogen levy, about how the government's proposing to fund that. So as Bryony was saying, the plan at the moment is to levy the cost of these subsidies for low carbon hydrogen on domestic energy bills, gas and heating, and electricity as well. We see already with green levies how politically toxic they can be for the wider net zero cause. So I'm quite concerned about adding yet another net zero cost onto people's energy bills, when we know that energy bill levies are a particularly aggressive way of funding the cost of net zero policies. There's the perversity, as Bryony was saying, about the fact that lots of domestic consumers are going to not use hydrogen because it's unlikely to be the main solution for decarbonising heat. And so it seems unfair that they should pay for it through their bills. And then the other factor, which I think is particularly problematic as well, is the distortive effect that we are creating across our energy bills for people, where all the levies are heaped on electricity, the legacy renewables costs, energy efficiency schemes, very little is on gas, despite the fact electricity is the lower carbon fuel, despite the fact we need it to get cheaper if we're going to incentivize the electrification, which I think is going to be the key decarbonisation pathway in lots of sectors. So really the idea of adding this cost of hydrogen onto electricity, making that disparity even worse, I think is very challenging. So I think as far as possible, the government should look to extend its 2025 cut-off date for public sector, public funding of this early stage of hydrogen's deployments. It is an R&D policy at the moment. It's trying to get the cost down, fund those initial projects. I think it is the sort of thing that we should fund publicly initially. And then once the costs have reached a certain level, the cost should be put on industry that are going to use it, which is likely to be heavy industry, fertilizer manufacturers, and so on. And I think that is how we should look to fund it. So those three areas: energy efficiency, Ofgem's remit, and hydrogen levies, are the three that I think have come up most in our conversations. But I look forward to talking more in the discussion.
Thank you, Sam. That was a great rundown and much to think about. I'm now going to turn to Matt Copeland. Matt is Head of Policy at National Energy Action, and he's going to, I think, focus on issues around private rented sector energy efficiency standards. The National Energy Action is also a secretariat for the APPG on fuel poverty and energy efficiency. So sort of keen to hear your perspectives, Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to the APPG for inviting me to speak today. For those of you who don't know, NEA is a national fuel poverty charity, and we directly help households on the ground who are struggling to afford energy, but we're also a campaigning charity, hence my involvement today. And fuel poverty is a really significant issue at the moment. I'm sure you would have seen in the news and in your work that 6.7 million households, we think, are paying 10% or more on their energy bills at the moment, and that could increase to 8.4 million in April, depending on the decisions of the Treasury in particular with regards to the energy price guarantee. And a big part of that struggle is the energy efficiency of our housing stock. We have found in our own work that those households on the lowest incomes living in the least efficient homes have been the most exposed by the high energy prices caused by the crisis over the past year or 18 months. And stats have come out just a couple of weeks ago that show that more than 3 million homes in England live on a low income in a property with an EPC of less than C. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done in England, but also in the other UK nations as well. And those figures also show the state of housing in the private rented sector, which we think is a particular problem. 1.1 million low-income households live in inefficient privately rented properties, in total paying about £500 million a year extra compared to if they were living in EPC properties. So that's a huge amount of extra money spent by private renters compared to if they were living in decent energy efficiency homes. And just over 200,000 privately rented homes are living in the worst performing properties, EPC F and G properties, and they're paying about £1,500 extra per household just to meet their normal costs of energy compared to an EPCC property. So the extent of poor energy in the private rented sector is really significant. So how has that come about? So we have a couple of important legal obligations. One is a net zero one, which we're all very familiar with, but also there's a fuel poverty obligation as well, a legal obligation for the government to ensure that all fuel poor households reach EPCC by 2030. There's also a minimum standard at the moment in the private rented sector for all privately rented homes to reach EPCE. But as I said before, lots of households not meeting that standard, and even if they did, it wouldn't be enough to meet other statutory obligations. So what do we do about it? Well, the government has already consulted on raising that minimum standard to EPCC. So it's pretty much government policy that we need to get privately rented housing to EPCC, but we haven't heard back from the government on a decision from that yet. But we also need to do other things like help landlords to make those investments through tax exemptions when they actually make those purchases to upgrade their properties. And we need local authorities to be able to enforce those rules as well, potentially through a new landlords database so they can identify those landlords who aren't adhering to the rules. And there's an imperative to act on this. The benefits to tenants are clear, with significantly lower bills on offer if we get energy efficiency right in the private rented sector, and they eclipse the associated increases with the cost of rent. Warmer homes also lead to greater levels of health and well-being, with cold homes costing the NHS £1.4 billion a year. And as the Net Zero review said as well, actually helping low-income households to reduce their bills is good for the local economy. Huge carbon savings on offer too, with 7.2 megatons of CO2 equivalent that come with those tightening standards, and benefits to landlords as well. Houses rated EPCC typically sell for about 6% more than Band D properties, and there's also evidence that those upgrades, which improve the comfort and affordability of properties, also improves their rentability, and also reducing tenants' bills reduces the risk of them getting into rent arrears. So what can be done by it? First and foremost, I think we need to get that government stated ambition of getting the PRS properties to EPCC into the bill as a minimum standard for landlords to meet. And we can do that by pretty much mirroring what the government stated in that consultation previously. There also needs to be that complementary policy of a landlord database that the government has also consulted on. We think that can also be done within the bill. But those incentives for landlords in the form of sort of tax exemptions would need to be done separately through Treasury, but that does need to happen pretty much at the same time, we think, otherwise it's not particularly fair on landlords. We do have a couple of other priorities in the bill that we think are important. So overall, we think we're not going to get to net zero unless it's fair and affordable. And some of the households who will find it particularly hard are those on prepaid meters. And they have really been brought to the forefront recently, and the government has been quite supportive of those in prepayment meters. But there's some things the government can't do without changes in law. For example, we need to have the powers to stop forced installation of prepay meters, and that's something that could be done within this energy bill. And we also need to speed up and accelerate the installation of smart meters for those who are currently on prepay, so we can end the scourge of legacy old style prepay meters, which provide an awful experience for their users. If you want to talk to me about any of that, please do get in touch. But thanks again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Matt, and I think some really powerful statistics you provided there to set the context for some of the discussion on the bill for the future. I'm going to now turn to Gillian Cooper. Gillian is from Citizens Advice, where she's been head of energy policy since 2018 and has had to work widely across a number of energy sector organisations, including the New Homes Quality Board, Consumer Futures, Consumer Focus, and Energy Watch. So, Gillian, thank you for joining us today. Keen to understand where you feel some of your sort of clients at Citizens Advice would see most benefit from this bill.
Thank you, and thank you to the APPG for inviting me. So for those of you who don't know, Citizens Advice has a statutory role in the energy sector. We're the statutory consumer advocate and also the advice provider. So we see the energy security bill as putting the building blocks in place that support the next phase of the net zero transition and help us move towards a world of a smarter, more flexible energy system. I think from the perspective of sort of how this is going to land with the public, I think, you know, it's been said many times before, but the earlier phases of the transition were arguably a lot easier because there wasn't much of a direct access to the public. But we're now moving into the more difficult phase as we need people to make changes to their homes and how they use energy in them. And that is a tough sell, particularly in a cost of living crisis, even if the payback period for some of these types of investments has dropped dramatically. So via our statutory role, we're already working on many of the areas that the bill is going to address. One of the things it will do is help evolve the existing capacity market arrangements, which is the current support mechanism for bringing forward this type of flexible capacity. In order to improve our energy security, we need a wide-ranging approach. We need both energy efficiency and customer flexibility in order to reduce demand and on the system, while also ensuring that the market arrangements work as effectively as possible. And both the energy bill and the current review of electricity market arrangements are helping address this. And we think ultimately that driving innovation in the low carbon flexible capacity market that we're going to be relying on during periods of low renewables output will help bring energy costs down for people and reduce the country's dependency on fossil fuels. But I think it's not enough just to change the system. We also need people to be encouraged to play their part in changing how they use energy in their homes. And this is where the bill can help with some of the other changes that it's proposing. It needs to be done well and in a way that encourages as many people as possible to participate, because then the benefits from the transition will be shared. We're doing quite a bit of work with the Energy Department at the moment on a new consumer or end user forum, which looks at the REMA arrangements. And it's, there are billions at stake here. It's estimated that demand side flexibility can deliver savings of up to £4.7 billion per year by 2030. But this is only going to work if energy companies and other innovators can bring forward propositions that people want to take up and the benefits are properly shared with the public. And in order to move forward into this world in a successful way, we have to plug some of the gaps that mean people in Britain pay more than they need to for their energy bills. And I think it goes without saying that using energy in a more flexible way is a much easier ask to make of the public when you live in a warm and a comfortable home. So fixing our leaky homes has to be an absolute priority here, because you don't have energy security when you're losing a huge chunk of the cost of heating your home, when it's escaping through the roof of the walls. We've published some research recently that estimated that an average EPC-D home in this country is spending £350 more a year than a home that's at EPC-C. And homes that are sort of F or G rated, the worst rated, are spending up to £950 more a year. So we've got some welcome announcements from the government in this area, but we need more if we're going to turn this around for people, because as Matt highlighted before, we're not on track to hit the government's fuel poverty target. We're not on track to hit the Climate Change Committee's pathways for things like heat pump installations and improving energy efficiency. And we do need to always keep recognizing that this is a big ask we're making of the public, and it isn't going to happen unless we've got a proper demand side strategy. We need much more of a focus on engagement and advice so people know what's happening, how they can play their part and be properly supported to do so. We've got to reach households who are at risk of falling through the gaps here. So Citizens Advice recently published a report looking at issues in the private rented sector, where we estimated there's 2.7 million households living in damp, moldy or cold homes, and that includes 1.6 million children. So we do need a better package of support. Like the others, we also think upgrading the minimum energy efficiency standards is an essential here. We want all new tenancies in the private rented sector to be EPC-C by 2025 and existing tenancies by 2028. And in order to do that, we need much better green finance offers and opportunities for landlords, and proper enforcement action where we're not seeing that movement. So adding in binding targets to the bill will help us make that progress and ensure that people live in warmer, safer homes. And just another report we published recently, which we see as another sort of essential building block, was our report on social tariffs last week, which was a result of a 9-month project with the Social Market Foundation and Public First, which came forward with a proposal for formula-based lump sum payments. And again, we sort of see that as a way that you can help build and maintain public consent for the transition by protecting those households who are less likely to benefit from these new initiatives just because of affordability reasons. And finally, the bill gives us a new role together with Ofgem in bringing in new regulations for heat networks. The number of households living on heat networks is expected to expand significantly in coming years. And it's right that these households will benefit from similar consumer protections to those with a standard gas or electricity supply to their home. So we will be the new statutory advocate and advice provider, and we're starting the planning process now for how we'll discharge our new responsibilities together with Ofgem and the Energy Department. And again, it's really welcome that this gap is going to be plugged as a result of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and really do appreciate the opportunity for citizens' advice engagement today, and no doubt in the questions that we're about to go into now. I don't know whether anyone has any questions they specifically want to ask. So I said parliamentarians usually get the first sort of turn, and then we'll move on to associate members afterwards. As always, delighted that our Vice Chair, Caroline Lucas, has her hand up first to hit the button. So Caroline, can I bring you in, please?
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you so much for those presentations, incredibly helpful. Yes, I stuck my hand up first, actually, because I need to dash to get a train, otherwise I won't be in London in time. But my very quick question was to Bryony, and apologies, I missed the very first bit of it, so maybe you covered it. But I wanted to ask whether anyone has talked about putting amendments down around the MER duty, you know, the duty to maximise the economic recovery of oil and gas, just picking up on what you were saying earlier about the bill going through at exactly the same time as we've got more licensing and so forth happening in the North Sea. It does seem that there's a real contradiction between net zero aspirations on the one hand, or obligations indeed, and the MER duty on the other. And the other thing just to ask as well is if there's anything, was there any debate about the crossover potentially between this bill and the levelling up bill when it comes to some of the planning issues? I'm thinking about, for example, mandatory solar panels on all new home builds. Is that, where is that going to fit, I suppose? Does that have to wait for another planning bill, or is there any kind of way that that can be added to this as well?
Thanks, Caroline. The conversation about the upstream policy was very informative, because it kind of spanned the whole political spectrum, from those peers who were very keen that we move ahead with lots more licensing of fossil fuel extraction, and those people who are very keen to see no more extraction at all. And where I think the debate should be pursued is in making sure that we have a policy on supply side which actually integrates the concerns about climate change at an international level. And I think where we fall down is, at the moment, the polarization of this debate is between government's policy, which is saying why would we not extract if someone
I don't know if we've just
do it
lost.
worse than we will. Sorry,
Bryony, you're breaking up a bit there.
Sorry. I'm having all sorts, I don't know if it's the weather, but I'm having all sorts of internet problems. Perhaps if I stop my video. Is that any better?
I think so.
Okay. I was just going to round up by saying that where we need to get to is that we need to understand that what we do domestically has a huge significance internationally if we're trying to get overall extraction of fossil fuels down in a managed decline. How can it be that very wealthy countries like the UK, who have exploited our affordable fossil fuel reserves, how can we be sending a message that we're going to carry on doing this, and that will not have a knock-on effect internationally of every other country seeking to do the same thing? So there is a real gap in government policy, whether you address it through changing MER, or whether we have to have a broader conversation about what does a climate safe policy look like when it comes to extraction and supply. We're right in the foothills of that debate, and I hope it will continue when it gets to the Commons, because the current situation where we're only just relying on planning is not sufficient. There needs to be policy.
Thanks.
I wonder if I could ask a question, taking chair's prerogative. Obviously, when the bill comes back in the Commons, there will be this opportunity for members of Parliament to make amendments. I guess the question is whether there are specific Lord amendments that have fallen and could be taken back up again, to then be taken back up into the Lords if they fail in the Commons as well. I guess the question is, in the art of the possible, what are the amendments that the panelists think are most likely potentially to be taken up by the government in an amendments strategy? So if you were me, what amendments do you think I should be tabling to think about how I could, obviously I could be tabling amendments to make a statement to ask the government to be looking at things, and the government may not take those amendments on board. What are the most effective amendments that potentially might end up being on the statute book if pushed hard enough? I guess is the question I want to ask. Where should I focus my fire? Anyone would like to come in? I mean, Sam, you've given a number of priorities, so I don't know if you wanted to make any suggestions.
Yeah, I can dive in on that. I mean, I think as Bryony is saying, it seems like there's already some movement from the government front bench in the House of Lords phase on the hydrogen levy. I don't think it's a particularly significant concession from what I've read of it, unless something's come out over the weekends. But I think, yeah, the scale of the alliance between environmentalists not wanting to see the sort of break on heat pump electrification, which that would potentially cause, and people who are worried about adding more levies to bills, which I think is a reasonable chunk of MPs as well. I think the sort of combined weight of those different groups And I think the Labour front bench and the Lords as well was also pretty sceptical on it. I think the challenge is no one really has a clear idea of how we would fund that mechanism beyond the levy. And I think that makes it quite hard to know what the alternative is. And when you speak to government, they want to see the low carbon hydrogen economy being built. They want to see that investment start to flow into places like Teesside and industrial heartland areas where lots of the production of this low carbon hydrogen was likely to happen. But they don't know the fairest way of doing it. And I think that's the challenge. So it's not quite an off-the-shelf amendment, but I think pushing there on the levy and calling for ministers to think again, I think is an area where I think there is inevitably going to be some movement. The other one is on Ofgem's remit as well and adding net zero, and I think that is a reasonable amendment that I know people in government have been looking at, and people seem quite sympathetic to it. They think it might not be necessary to get the investment in grid infrastructure, but you speak to people in the renewable sector who are pretty confident that something like that is going to be needed. So again, it'd be worth having discussions with ministers about why they've sort of been reluctant to include that in the first tranche of the bill. But I think there's a pretty strong consensus on something like that. And grid is one of the big issues, as I know you highlighted very effectively in your review as well. So it does feel like that's something that where more is going to have to be given.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to come in? Yep.
Could I just add that there is likely to be a selection out of 4 or 5 amendments going into report stage, where the discussions are still happening but it seems likely that the Ofgem one will be picked up. The community energy provisions to try and make sure that that's allowable and supported, got a lot of support, and sure also a lot of backbench support in the Commons. There is, I think, a need to have a proper conversation about the hydrogen trials. At the moment, the principal duties that are outlined in the bill don't afford consumers enough protection, and it's caused an awful lot of anxiety. And I think all parts of the Lords agree that needs to be rounded out, and that on the face of the bill, there's much more about consumer protection and impartiality. At the moment, the bill is very much weighted towards the gas distribution networks being judge and jury, and it's just not appropriate, really. So there'll be a few things. I think on the broader strategy side of things, it always feels like a bit of a strange thing to use primary legislation to get government to deploy a strategy, which they can do themselves. But the real feeling is that the energy efficiency part, or the systems wide efficiency part of the equation, hasn't been taken seriously. And I imagine something might emerge that is asking for government to think again at about systems efficiency, which would incorporate building and household fabric of buildings, but it's not limited to that. And that's really where the nub of that electrification strategy needs to come from. It's a security supply issue. It's a climate change issue, and it's an affordability issue. And one thing just to note by way of colour is that the more leaky your house is, the more happy the hydrogen heating industry is, because it means that you don't have to put 4x4 inch holes into your house to allow hydrogen to be used safely. So there's this real tension at the moment between energy efficiency and household efficiency and the promotion of hydrogen in the home for home heating. And I just think it's quite scandalous. But if you want to get into a colourful debate about what this bill means to people on the streets, there is this very big tension between some of the combustion-based systems that are being promoted and the fabric of the efficiency of the households, where the leakier it is, the better it is for hydrogen.
Thank you. If no other parliamentarians had any questions, I'm going to turn to Joe Tetlow from Green Alliance, who's got a question. Joe, would you like to come in?
Yeah, hi Chris, and thanks everyone for your great contributions. I put a question in the chat, but I'm actually going to ask a different question if that's okay, which is, and it's for Matt specifically, and it's having talked to some MPs about the private rented sector, there's a sort of increasing concern about the fact that increased regulations on landlords might lead to landlords leaving the sector, and that will have a knock-on effect in terms of the affordability of rent. So I don't know if you've done any analysis, if there's any information out there about the effect that an increase in regulation on the private rented sector might have, and whether that's actually something which is a real concern, or something which has perhaps been blown up slightly.
So I think there is genuine concern out there, but what I would say is that, as I said in my sort of opening remarks, this does need to come with incentives for landlords as well. So there does need to be some sort of give on the Treasury side as well as the regulatory side. It has to be carrot and stick with this. And there's no other way that I can see to make sure that the private rented sector actually does meet the right standard. As to what really sort of happens, there are clear benefits for landlords in terms of upgrading properties, in terms of property values, the rental income they can get from it, and payments from their tenants as well, to make sure tenants do pay on time. And actually the increased rents that would occur, whether it's landlords putting up rents to cover the cost, some of the costs at least, or because landlords are leaving the market, would be less than the energy savings, particularly with persistently high energy prices that we expect over the next decade or so. So overall, the picture looks pretty positive in terms of tenants, and we think in terms of landlords as well. And we've seen limited evidence that when these regulations have come in the past, that the size of the private rented sector has changed. So although there are genuine concerns about this, what the past tells us is that it doesn't have a huge impact on the sector, but also we do need to think about what adjacent policies we can put in place to make sure we're not just hammering landlords and we are giving incentives as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Joe.
If we don't have any more questions, I think it's time for one more, but if no one has one to offer up, I think we are sort of coming near to the end of the session anyway. So actually we've got Stuart Dossett. Stuart, do you want to come in with a sort of final question for the panel? And maybe this is an opportunity also for the panel in answering to sort of also give some of their final reflections on the bill. It's been a really useful briefing session. I'm really grateful to everyone. Stuart.
Thanks, Chris. Apologies if this might be a bit niche and in the detail then for the final question. So feel free to ignore and just give you a summary if you want. But it's particularly a question for Sam Hall, but equally interested in the views of all the panelists, and it relates to the Ofgem net zero duty amendment. So in the Lords at the moment, ahead of report stage, there are currently 2 different amendments that have been tabled. One which updates the 3 components that constitute the sort of current and future consumer interests and points that towards the Climate Change Act. The other appears, though I'm not expert in this, to actually put a specific duty outside of the consumer interests for achieving net zero on Ofgem. And I was just wondering if Sam and the panelists had a preference for one or other of those formulations.
Yeah, very, very good question. Yeah, I mean, in the briefing that we've been circulating to MPs, which I confess that my colleague Jack Richardson, who's now on, would put together. So I'm not sure why he went for this, but he suggested the future and present consumer version. I think, yeah, obviously there were going to be concerns about Ofgem straying from its strict remit to look after energy customers. And I think it is, yeah, it's right that it constantly has that focus on keeping down costs and making sure things aren't more expensive. And I understand the reason why they've been concerned historically about allowing this anticipatory investment, because they don't want networks to go away, raise a load of expensive debt, build infrastructure that's not going to be used, and then pay the profits back of that to their shareholders. It's an understandable reason, but at the same time, because it's taking us so long to deploy this cheap renewable electricity and all these other technologies like heat pumps, consumers aren't realizing the benefits as quickly as they could. So in an energy security crisis and cost of living crisis driven by high fossil fuel prices, it is causing consumers lots of extra expense now. So I think it's worth taking that small risk that there may be some stranded assets in order to get that more immediate benefit that we can have from renewables bringing down our energy bills. So I think, yeah, fine to keep the focus on on consumers, but having that slightly wider perspective in terms of future consumers as well as current ones, and what their costs might be like. Because if we fail to tackle climate change, obviously the costs of that in 2 or 3 decades time are going to be way more than a few bits of network infrastructure that we've built, which we didn't actually to end up needing. So I think, I think that formulation should do the trick, but Ofgem need that steer, I think, to know that they can go away to network companies and allow this infrastructure investment to happen.
Thanks, Sam. Would any of the panelists like to come in by way of summing up this discussion and on that final point?
I suppose I would just say that at the moment you've got a system that is tilted towards the incumbent operators, and anything that we do that can help Ofgem to get out of a mindset which is essentially serving the industry that it regulates and into something more strategic will be really, really welcome. And we are where we are, but we've created a certain amount of investor lack of confidence in investors and a lack of clarity, because we're pursuing this dual strategy of hydrogen and electricity in the home. And that's just causing a lot of confusion and unnecessary doubt in investors' minds. It is pretty clear, 33 independent studies have said that hydrogen in the home will be very limited, if at all. So why are we pursuing it? It's because we have an incumbent industry, the boiler manufacturers and the gas distribution network. It's not even the upstream suppliers, it's the boiler manufacturers and the gas distributors who are driving this agenda. And their marketing and their hype and their advocacy is way ahead of anybody else in the field. You speak to some of the geothermal heat loop providers or the heat pump manufacturers, they don't have anything like the level of access to government that the incumbents do. And they certainly don't have the level of involvement with Ofgem that the incumbents do. So we have to use this legislation to signal there's going to be a change of strategy that enables us to take the most sensible options, not the ones that are most suited to the people who are currently providing us with energy. And that's at the heart of the problem, Chris. And if you can get to the heart of that, then you'll be doing a brilliant service to the sector, because then capital can flow to the most sensible options and not be scared that government's going to tilt the playing field in favour of the incumbents, which is what's happening at the moment.
And just
Thank
one
you.
other aspect, it'll also bring forward the role as a future system operator, which will really help in this space as well. At least we hope. And I think the other thing to flag is this will hopefully, once we've sort of got this bill, because it is sort of tidying up a lot of things where we've been waiting for decisions in a lot of areas, it will help bring forward hopefully some more policy stability. That means we can start to address some of the sort of wider gaps that we've got, and give businesses the stability to invest and the confidence to invest, and also people to make those investments in their homes.
Thank you very much.
I'll just come in very quickly as well. I want to repeat something that Gillian said earlier, and that a fair and affordable transition to net zero is really important. If we have an expensive and unfair transition, then people won't buy into it and we will never ever get there. So seeing all these different changes through the lens of, is this fair and is this affordable? So should we be placing a hydrogen levy on consumers? Should we be making more homes more energy efficient? How do we protect low-income households from the extra costs of anticipatory investment through things like a social tariff, as Gillian spoke about before? If we can make sure that through all these changes, we maintain fairness and affordability, or get back to affordability even, then we'll have a much better chance of getting to net zero.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you so much to everyone for taking part in the panel discussion today on the energy bill. I'm looking forward, obviously, to when it returns to the Commons, and obviously we'll maintain the sort of focus on the sort of passage of report stage for the Lords. Thank you everyone for attending this all-party group on the environment event today, and do look out for future events as and when they come. We're grateful for the quality of the discussion and look forward to working with everyone in due course. But thank you very much for today, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye.